record on this computer. So
the island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, they sell dolls with no faces.
Yeah.
So they said, well, if they've got no face, then it's not got an ethnic background.
Yeah.
And the doll can represent any ethnic background it wishes because it has no known face.
Yeah, that was along the lines that I was going with it, sort of putting yourselves into that shoe. So yeah,
we've got two of them here somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I like them. My mum's got those ones that I don't know if any of you have seen. Is always like it's normally like mother and daughter. They normally hugging each other. She's got them plastered around the house, like ones of me and her, etc. They're quite sweet, but as a kid I never used to understand why they didn't have any faces. I wanted to draw on them my own little faces, but I realise now that would look awful, but it bugged me as a child. Yeah, so I've put it down as medieval settlement, but I'm focusing just on two. Normally I tend to look at say 6 cases and sort of try and compare them, but with this I looked at 2, and it was to just make a point, really. And it was something that I really did enjoy, and it was something that was kick-started partly by the Cornwall trip that we went to. We stopped off to Hound near Exeter, and yeah, it was just something that I just thought was amazing, because I thought we were just looking at a Bronze Age monument and got behind it, and there was this old deserted settlement. So like I said, it was the Cornwall trip that inspired me to do this, and I definitely got stuck into reading about it. And I was impressed with the amount of research that has been behind it.
Jess, what is Hound?
Well, that's the original name of it.
Is it? Right,
yeah.
Isn't that? Right. Yeah.
That was the one thing that annoyed me when I was researching. In the Doomsday Book, that is how it's spelt. And right. Some people were naming it Hound, some of them were saying Hundator. So it was definitely, once I got to grips with that, it was much easier. But for a while, I was sort of limiting myself on the sources. But this is a settlement. I think it's got a lot behind it, and definitely in terms of the story of archaeology in the 20th century as well. And I wanted to compare that to Wharram Percy, only because this is a settlement that they argued as well to be something that made it a wider debate, instead of just looking at one settlement and looking at the economic part of it or looking at the feudal part of it. We were really sort of getting to grips with maybe looking at social aspects of it, or how they lived, or what it would have looked like, or their diet. And it brought me to a wider debate. I ended up getting to a lot of literature where they were reflecting on the archaeology in general in terms of settlements, and that was very interesting, how there was different types of methodologies used. And archaeologists, they called it the new archaeology age in the 80s, where technology was really starting to get better. And it was almost like historians sort of stopped ignoring archaeologists. They were actually taking them seriously, because historians tend to dominate, and what archaeologists were doing were they were listening to the historians or looking at too much documentary evidence, and they go into digs with too much in their head, so much so that they're jumping to assumptions rather than actually investigating the area as a whole. So that was something that I've been doing with St Mary's Well Bay. I didn't really oversaturate myself with knowledge of the area too much, only little bits, because I didn't really want to jump to assumptions like but like we said, we want to have fresh eyes when you look at something, and sometimes having too much research can just cloud that. So yeah, it was definitely something very interesting to look at, how people have taken different takes on this. And they all tell a different story. That's why there's now an argument that settlement should be analysed individually. And I think there should be a case of this being in terms of Wales as well, because what I'm finding is that there is the odd site in Wales that's got a lot of research behind it, but I don't think as much as England. And it would just be nice to see if there was just, we could look at this as a whole in terms of settlements, but not just England as well as Wales. And it'd be quite interesting to see any links between them as well. And I think Wharram Percy puts forward a good case to why we need to just analyse everything individually, because they started to really look into this site, and it was an amazing site to start off with. But once they started looking into it and taking different takes, they started using isotope levels, for example, to look at for diets of the people that lived there, and you just paint a picture of what it was like to live there. So, like I said, Wharram Percy, we're going to do this first. You can see the earthworks already there. It's amazing, and LiDAR imagery is quite good of this as well. LiDAR imagery we'll get into, but is I'm sure Carl's mentioned, but it's like aerial photography, but it just sort of scans everything, and it gives back more clearer traces of what once was there. So it's very good for looking at field systems as well. And it is quite frustrating because most LiDAR imagery places you have to pay for it, and some of the sites that I've been looking into with it, they'll have the whole of Britain sort of mapped out for free, and then you'll get to certain areas and there'll just be nothing, and you just want to cry because you think, out of all the spots, the one spot that I wanted is not there. But I think this is the reason why people this was a site that was praised, and rightly so, because of the amount of archaeology. But I think what people were doing was they were taking the assumptions from this and just putting it on everything else. And as people started to look more into it, they started to realise that you could definitely tell more of a story. And that's why what I wanted to touch on this. I didn't really want to go into this too much because that's not something that I was focusing on when I first started doing this. But Wharram Percy's been something that's been very interesting to compare with, and we will as we go all the way through. So those are the two ways of saying it, and the Domesday Book reference is down there, and that's the name of it by here. So yeah, that's where everyone's getting their idea from. But there was a lord here, and it was sort of a settlement that was associated with a manor that was nearby, and it was owned by that settlement was owned with another settlement nearby owned by the same person. And this is known as a DMV, so a deserted medieval village, and it's meant to be, like I said, there was another one nearby. There's a 3 in total, but this one's the one that's very clear, and it's the one that we went to visit. I thought it was going to be much harder to find, but it was so much clearer once you started walking over the hill. And I don't know, I just felt enchanted walking through, because I just said I could imagine that the streets and people walking down there, and not so many streets, it's just sort of like a little lane really that connected everyone together. But it was very interesting to look at. And it was excavated in the 1960s, and that was where they were able to reveal many of the walls and the buildings, and the ditches are clearly visible today. And we see that we've got to let the land tell the story of this area. We have to strip the landscape down to this earlier layer of occupation, and this is Neolithic, which we will get further on into. But when in the 1930s they found a lot of flint scatter there, and obviously they've got a monument from the Bronze Age there as well. And the medieval period was first discovered in this medieval period part of the landscape was found in 1953 by a Norman Quinnell, and he was working for an OS archaeology division, and they were then excavating this from 1961 to 1975, and this was by Mrs. Elizabeth Marie Minter, and it was very sad because she worked a lot on this. This was something that she was very passionate about, but unfortunately she had died before she was able to publish any of her work, before she even finished the report. And I think that would be very interesting to see what she would have to say on this as well. But Guy Beresford had then jumped in 1979, and he has been someone who's created a lot of academic work that is available through Google Scholar that you can look at as well. And he really did try to look through a note and try and go from there, really, and he kind of had a very interesting way of looking at this. He said that he based his theory on the evidence of the staked holes that was found in Minter's excavations, which had predated the stone structures, and to him they indicated turf houses, which we will get into. But then the thinking had changed to the excavation at nearby hut holes cast doubt the existence of these early features. And I think there's a lot of confusion when it comes to here, because there's so much and so little at the same time. But they believed that this was also a sift and Lord, and they did create some income. It wasn't much, but you could tell that they were sort of using the land around them to create their income. And I just think it was it was an amazing find, and it really was a true beauty, I think, for us to look at. And this photo here is part of the larger house that is there. And originally people thought this was a manor, but it just turned out it was just a big house with a little bit of a garden that was just on the edge of the site. And it is definitely, sometimes looking at a plan from high above is possibly a little bit better than looking on ground, because sometimes it's quite hard to get your bearings, because you would just see loads of stones. I'm quite short, so I don't really get a very good perspective on things, I don't think. But there was a lot of corn dryers here. There was three barns. There was 4 long houses, and they had a small plot of land enclosed into these long houses as well, so almost like a little garden themselves. And the village is still visible by the walls, and I think you can even see down to the little porches and the doorways. You can even see the stones that were used to be used as steps, as some of them are very worn away. It is amazing to look at. And I think when we got there, I think when we saw one of this big building that we're looking at, I think one of the first things that I had said, or someone said, and I agreed, I can't really remember the conversation, but along the lines of something said, oh, maybe this is a church. And I was like, oh, maybe. But it wasn't. It was just very big, long house. And they believed that looking at this was a land that was based around farming, and they noticed that there was a passage as well that had separated people from animals, and is seen with 2 entrances. And when they did look at the landscape as a full, they also saw that there was ploughing nearby, which was surrounded by a field system, and they believed that was near another field system of ploughing that was from the 19th century as well. So this is a piece of land that's seeing a lot of use right from the Neolithic right up to to present date, really, is still being used. And there's a lot of little settlements nearby in this area, but this is the best preserved one, and the best one, I think, to look at to gain a understanding. But when you look at the plans and the dwelling plans for them, they're very interesting. They're online. And there would have been a hearth at the top, which we had all seen. There would have been a living area. There would also been the way that they think that it was created, maybe area for some water sort of to flow in and sort of be kept. from a nearby river, but this is all theorized. There's been loads of plans that have been uploaded, and a lot of them conflict each other because people don't know and they're just theorizing. And there's a very good blog called legendarydartmoor.co.uk, and they discuss this, and some of the plans that they show are absolutely amazing. But they even talk about how there was pottery found here that was either courseware or unglazed type, and they think that that was probably produced in the Tottenham area. And they even found assemblage of domestic stone artifact, loads of rubbing stones, etc., which was very interesting. And one thing that they definitely ruled out from just looking at this, because they saw a lot of evidence of living, is that this was not a case of an emergency excavation. So if it was in a village for refuge, that they had drawn that out completely. I think the conclusion that I had come to this is that the reason that it was deserted was not due to disease or it being a refuge place or attack. I just think that just over time the land just got harder to deal with, and people eventually moved on to something else. But they have left their mark there, and it's a very these buildings haunt the landscape to show what once was. So I mentioned this. There has been some discussion of this. They think that they would have had houses with a thatched rooftop. However, some believe that, and like I said, Guy Beresford, who discussed this, in his article by Guy Beresford, it's called 3 Deserted Medieval Settlements on Dartmoor, and it's by Medieval Archaeology. In 1988, and he basically argued that the turf was used here to protect their houses for warmth, and you can see that, he said, in the walls. And he said that it wasn't a common practice in the British Isles until the 19th century central Scottish Highlands, but he said that, you know, there must be a reason to uphold such a persistent tradition of building, and he really did look into this. He generally had felt that's what they had done before, they had these stone houses. You think that it was some sort of turf house as well, and he said that this was due to the fact that it needed less labour. It kept them warm. It was materials that were around them. It was very durable against the wind. And he looked at this at the stakeholds. That was part of his reasoning of it. And he said the construction of a new turf wall was to take down what was on the building and put some new turf on, and then put the old turf, either burn it for fuel, and then maybe possibly spread some leftover spreader on the fields to replace the humus and the areas of fresh earth that had been cut. So almost living with the landscape, really knowing how to deal with that. So that was a very interesting way of discussing it, and I think he's just waiting for a challenge, really, because no one's really challenged that as such other than this blog. But it would be quite interesting to see more of a discussion, because at the moment I think this settlement's in the early stages of scholars discussing it, because this doesn't seem to be a lot of different theories and interpretations being put forward. It just seems to be one person, especially Guy Beresford. He's really dominated this. And I think people aren't really challenging him. I'd like to see him challenged. This is a book that I bought quite recently, and it is by a journal that I really like called Medieval Archaeology. And they contain loads of different excavation reports, loads of analysis reports, and different types of things in terms of archaeology, obviously centered around medieval archaeology, and they started in 1957, and this is the 50 years when Swiss goes right up to 2007. And they definitely tell us a story of a great shift between the way archaeology was carried out, and it's just reflecting on the best articles really that they think has been groundbreaking in terms of that time period and looking at archaeology. It's a big chunky book. You can get it on Amazon. It is it's not cheap, but at the same time I didn't mind paying for it because it wasn't. I've had to buy books in the past and they're like 120 quid. So this one was only 50. So used, I think I got it for £30, but it was definitely interesting to read. And it was even a plus point for me because I could actually reference it. But I think what this whole thing came into was a discussion of what is medieval, and it was something that I've had to tackle, and it definitely leads to confusion. And Carl sort of alluded to it in, I think it was the Irish roundhouses. He was saying about the beginning of the medieval period, and he said some people say this. He said, but I say around about after 410, and I generally agree with him. I do think he's straight after the Roman collapse in Britain. But this reflection tells us really what is archaeology in terms, what is medieval in terms of archaeology. And they show us the characteristics of it, and definitely one of them is the discussion of deserted settlements in Britain. And medieval archaeology is, they tell you a little story at the beginning of, well, the collections are one of the first ever articles written right up to one of the recent of the time. And it is amazing to see how it changes, and you can see that the whole premise of this journal being made was that they felt like the Antiquities journal was good, but they felt like they needed something more specialised for medieval archaeology because it has a different type of discipline to it. It's not like prehistory where there's no documentary evidence, but it's not like modern history where there's loads of documentary evidence. There's a little bit in the middle, and they felt like it just needed its own space, and definitely something that has well, a lot of the sources that I'm talking about has come from this journal. So yeah, I praise them highly, especially this book, because just looking at it, they just showed us from the beginning. A lot of the archaeologists were very, what they would say, conservative in their thinking. And as time went on, it become more social, more liberal in a way, and they're more accepting. And you definitely see, I think the one interesting thing that I saw in all of this is the confidence of archaeologists as well, how as technology develops, they're having more of a way of letting them be the horse that pulls the cart. It's my favourite phrase, but that's how archaeology should be. Historians shouldn't be dictating to archaeologists. It should be the other way around, because with the science, etc., that we have now, I think archaeology can be more conclusive with the evidence than history. And I just think that's why archaeologists and historians need to work together, rather than maybe historians sort of not considering archaeology as much, because archaeology is important just as much as the story. So like I said, what is medieval? There's just something that I want to brush upon, because it was a very interesting debate, but I think towards the end it was starting to drive me up the wall. And the two people that looked at it, so the first person that I looked at it was David Austin. He had a chapter in a book called From the Baltic to the Black Sea, Studies in Medieval Archaeology. And his chapter was called The Proper Study of Medieval Archaeology. And this was in 1990, and it's very harsh, I think, to archaeologists, I think, especially for the time it is. But you've got to think this is about 10 years after the new age of archaeology, and I think there's still a little bit of hesitation with archaeologists based on, again, what David Austin now says. He says that documents are a problem. They are the problem. They are originally created by the elite in his eyes. and they don't answer the questions that historians and archaeologists are looking for. So he said the dilemma in archaeology really is the compulsion to offer interpretations of a site straight away before you get there without any evidence, and he blames this all on historians. He says they're discrediting archaeology. And he said that, he said one of the issues, and I think it's one of the issues that I talk about, he said there's a lot excavated but very little is published. And because of that, it's not allowing the sharing of information, not allowing us to have better interpretation and tell everyone the true story. He even talked about focusing on maybe one type of material. He said that if you're going out field walking, looking just for pottery, he said that can cloud your mind. He said look out for anything from that time period rather than just looking for one specific thing, because you can miss out so much more important things. He even goes on to talk about how they need to be more progressive and sort of take in account other cultures. So that he really does go into it, and very well. He even said that this is all political. He said this is maybe this is sort of allowing us not to sort of look any further, because we're looking at things from the elite and we're not having a better analysis all around. He said that too many things are focused on constitutional monarchy or parliamentary democracy or a system. He said that there's too much of conquest as well, and colonies, etc. And what he was saying was that settlements like Hound, he said that they're basically normally or no one conquest, disease got rid of them in the end of that, and they just focus more on things that are put in the Doomsday Book. And he said, well, he doesn't want to stand for that anymore. He wants to have a look at more of the everyday lives. And he said that post-war world, that's when things started to change. People were not so much interested in this idea of a conquest, and he said this gradual evolution, it helped archaeology to have a very good analysis on everything. But he said he's just pushing to be for it to be, for archaeologists to ditch this great history elitist sort of way of looking at things and possibly just look at the daily lives. And he said that Wharram, Percy is a great place. He said it is very good, but he says we shouldn't be looking at that solely. He said, for example, he said some settlements had said that they were deserted because they looked at Wharram, Percy, and in the Tudor surveys and accounts, there was a large-scale evictions. That was exaggerated by the disaffected peasantry, and he says that archaeology is allowing us to have this lower level history and get more of a perspective. And I think that's what he's doing really here. He's even saying in new archaeology time in the 80s, this is providing methodologies and other paradigms to create a positivist history of an undocumented past. And he says that archaeology in the past has failed to find its own voice, but that's what he wants. And he wants to look for things. He said when he's looking at settlements, this is the things that he looks for. Humanity as an individual, humanity as a social being, humanity as a member of the biosphere, and how they're all interdependent with each other as well. And I definitely like that route of looking at it as well. And he says that we should sort of look at social structures, maybe look at the individual as a social component. And I think he puts forward a very good argument on how landscape can tell us more about the ways of life of living in a settlement. And then you go in further and you do see some more interpretations of that, which is even more interesting. Chris Jarrett even discusses this further, and he agrees with David Austin. He says, so we need to get rid of this whole idea of great man theory and maybe sort of look at the personal experience and use our imagination. But it's definitely interesting. I think that last book that I showed you just sort of showed you how that was present in the medieval archaeology, and how they were inspired post-war to do a change in terms of archaeology of these settlements. So one thing that I just wanted to quickly touch upon is this continual use of land, but throughout time, really. And like I said, this is something that's dated back to the Neolithic period. And you see that with quite a few settlements. Some people have brought this argument that this has sort of been a site that's been used throughout time, and this is a site that has sort of shown that. And I think it just shows that argument that we didn't drastically change when the Romans got here, and we didn't drastically change when they left either. It was almost like it was we sort of just adapted to it and took what we needed and then just carried on. But it's definitely something that's very interesting, and a lot of people have looked at this continual use of land, and have argued that this was a land that was important to medieval settlements because it was something that the local people had valued and used throughout time. Like I said, there was Neolithic evidence here. There was Bronze Age evidence. There was a Bronze Age burial that was nearby that Carl made poor Bill get on the floor and lie in, and then he had the cheek to say that he wasn't recording, and so Bill had to go back in that spot. But you could see how it's all linking in with each other. And I had read some arguments. It was quite interesting because I just wanted to see what maybe some people for the medieval period had thought of these old monuments to themselves. And some people even said that maybe some of them thought they were places of spiritual, and they even said places for the undead, which is quite an interesting interpretation. Never really had any evidence to back it up, but like I said, it was an interpretation, and people just didn't just it's just no evidence to it, just a suggestion. And this is a region that sort of lay beyond the main area of Romanization, and I think it just sort of showed that there was a different change in the management of the landscape. And I think there's definitely a relation to why these areas have a continual use of spaces, because they've always been perfect. Romans came so that they were perfect, but with the local people, and it's just something that people have been associated with now. Obviously, it's just got a lot of history, and it's left there to just haunt the land almost. But people still live in the area and still use it, but just not as much as they used to. And it definitely has brought up some interesting discussion. William Crossan in The Guides of Dartmoor even talks about how because of the continuous use of land, it affected the evidence that was being looked at. There was rabbit burrows, which were confused for prehistoric barrows for a second, but they definitely had to look at it more clearly, which they have done quite recently. Well, I say quite recently, it was in the 1960s, but they were using a lot of up-to-date technology, and I think that was very interesting to see how much dedication was put into this. And this is just some LiDAR imagery now. So that's the Hound Tor, really, the Bronze Age monument. And that's the car park here. And this is the area where Bill had to be put into the burial, and the settlement is all down by here. And you can definitely see from looking at it the different sort of systems to it. So it's a straight line here, and it goes down that way, goes down there, and then you've got this that goes into that, and there's a walkway that goes here, and that walkway that I just showed out there, that was very clear. And then you've got some other buildings around here as well, So it definitely is a much better way, I think, of looking at everything and just getting a clearer understanding, like a bit of LiDAR imagery myself. Just hate the fact that it's hard to get to. Managed to get hold of this thing called Digimaps if you're ever interested. I think some of it is free, but if you want something that's really fancy, you have to pay. But so far, it's been quite helpful for me. But yeah, Digimaps. So DIGI and maps, all one word as well. So that's worth to have a look as well. So the one I want to talk about, I mentioned these rabbit burrows and etc. This was something that Catherine Linehan had even discussed herself, and she was interested in this settlement just like I was. And she was a little bit upset that there was little interest in this area as well. And she was just looking at the rabbit warrens that had been surrounding them. And she said that when she looked at this in the Domesday Book, and she is right, that the parish was Manhattan. The plough lands, there was 4 of them. Ploughs were 2. And like I said, the manor was Hound, the name was Hundertor. And she said that there was, this was, you know, she felt like that maybe possibly there was an outfield as well for cultivation that was abandoned again, and a different area was ploughed. So she felt like they were using land and then moving on. But she noticed that there was these rabbit burrows, but they were perfectly placed. It was almost like they were being controlled when she was looking at them. And she felt like when she was discussing this, she felt like maybe they were sort of enclosing the rabbits in to protect their crops, maybe to get them from stop burrowing on their side. And then she then come up with another theory that maybe they were in a way of farming these animals. So it's definitely interesting, and she does provide evidence for both of them, and I do sway towards maybe possibly this being a place of farming of rabbits, because that would be another way of maybe income and another way of food for them as well. And she said that that, you know, these boundary walls that she had also been reinforced by a ditch on the outer moorland as well to prevent animals and deer from coming in. But she had seen it with these rabbit burrows as well, like this diagram that I'm showing you. And she just said that she felt like this was just their way of having of their economic factor that brought into the idea of expansion and a lot of population. But she said that this is something that she'd like to see more research of, but she is highly convinced of it. And the images that she provides of this as well is very convincing. And that's an article called Deserted Sites and Rabbit Warrens on Dartmoor, Devon, Medieval Archaeology Journal again, in 1966. You can get that online. And it was just very interesting how she went through that, how she was able to just look at both sides of the argument and come to her idea, but she kind of leaves it for you to decide as well. So there's alternative ways of investigation, and one of these was provided by Carenza Lewis. And her one was called New Avenues for Investigation of Currently Occupied Medieval Rural Settlement, Preliminary Observations from the Higher Education Fields Academy. Again, Medieval Archaeology Journal. I said this was something that I stuck with quite a lot. I just find it very easy for my research to use this journal. And this was in 2007, and she calls them CORES, so currently occupied rural settlements. And she said that she's looked at many academics such as Chris Taylor, who had highlighted the problems that excavations can help bring a lot of information, but when it comes to CORES, medieval activities failed to be reported. And she said that in the 1980s, again, this new age of archaeology, there's a use of other disciplines to analyse cause. And she said that a lot of them were based on assumptions rather than looking at the evidence, but because people couldn't really excavate there because they're currently occupied. And she said she had permission to excavate a cause, and she said another thing that's off-putting to look into them is just getting the permission as well. But she said that use of pottery, for example, is what she was looking for, and this is just what she used. She used test pitting in someone's garden, like what we see here, to look for pottery as evidence of occupation. And she looked at Terrington, St Clement, Unford and Houghton, and Whiten as well. And she said that she found that there was 2 distinctive settlements nucleated. She said there was 2 manors granted to an abbey of Ramsey in the 10th and the 10th century, and a share in the court and a priest for much of their history as well. This is stuff that she's managed to get from the Domesday Book and other sources, but she just wanted to have a look at the material, and she did find a lot of prehistoric material which she had linked into this continuous use of land as well. She found that there would have been a church in that area, and she sort of done this test pit closer to where the church was. She found even more pottery, and then the reduction, she said this showed that there was a reduction in population, that the pottery was not used. But today, this is still a large village, and it's sort of put towards how these are one of the settlements that survived and will have a continuous use of history from the prehistoric times as well. And she said that was just a very good example. So LiDAR map, so when you look closely at this, you see this on the LiDAR map. This is a Wharram Percy on the LiDAR map, but this can help understand the landscape without being invasive as well. You can just look without touching, and it can be very helpful as well for finding fields. And just looking at the imagery, you could just even say, oh, well, this would have been where someone had lived. And this has been used by a lot of people, especially in terms of Ralph File and Tony Brown, where they looked at beyond villages in open fields. That was their article name, and this was in the Medieval Archaeology Journal as well, 2006. They looked at LiDAR imagery to try and see where they would find any water source as well, and they even went further to look into other ways of analysis. But they felt like LiDAR imagery was able to just tell them of the ploughing fields and the plan of the settlement and what else they needed to find on there, and it can just give you a better extensive view of it all. And Guy Beresford even later down the line, when he was much older, looked at this and said, yeah, I tried using this in my investigation and it helped, but he obviously knew something was already there. So the next one that kept cropping up here, and it was in terms of looking at the turf walls, in terms of looking at the water supply, even looking at the ploughing of the field. And Guy Beresford jumps in with this. He comes in and he slams David Austin, because David Austin, he said that the pollen sequence that he had found is considered to be reflective of the activities of the Hound Tor farmers. But he said, no, I don't believe that at all. He said that this was down to the use of turf. And he said that this must be what this pollen sequence is telling us. But when they've looked closer, for example, Ralph Fale and Tony Brown, who wrote about this, they noticed that looking at the pollen sequence, they had suggested that there was a substantial clearance of woodland in lowland areas. And he even said that this sort of incorporated with this whole idea of ploughing on a field after using it so often, moving on to another field and abandoning it. So that was something that he had felt. But he looked at pollen sequence and he had felt like that they had found a water system nearby, and even went as further as to say that he believed that maybe possibly a mill would have been there as well. But that's something yet to be found. And it's definitely interesting because you look at all this and you sort of see how they're able to gain a picture just from everything that is around them. So the next one that was quite interesting is the isotope analysis. Obviously, they can't do that at Hound because there's no remains being found there as of yet. But like I said, it hasn't been heavily excavated, and not so much has been excavated there, and it would be quite interesting to see if there was anything nearby. But Sally Smith, she wrote an article called Towards a Social Archaeology of the Late Medieval English Peasantry, Power and Resistance at Wharram, Percy. And what a surprise, it's not Medieval Archaeology Journal, it's actually the Journal of Social Archaeology in 2009. And this is something that I think what old archaeologists wanted us to go towards, and is definitely happening now, which is great. And she said that she looked at all the isotope analysis that was being involved, and she looked at how this was able to tell us about the diet of the people in Wharram, Percy. And she had found that the diet from the weaning age was very, very poor. And that was because they weren't weaning their children properly. It was that whole belief in medieval medicine is that you breastfeed right up until they're old enough to hold their own, and then after that it's just the same as the adults. And this sort of comes into my discussion as well of the concept of childhood, how that affected the diet. They were put on food that was nearby that didn't have the nutrients that they needed to develop as well. So it was definitely interesting how she looked at that, and she compared that with the adults as well, and how that showed that there was a lack of nutrients in terms of the adults as well as the children. And she believed that maybe possibly this was due to not having enough around them. So it was almost like she came to a different conclusion, that unlike saying this was something that was evidence of people being evicted in the Tudor period, she said that this was possibly land that just didn't have the right nutrients in terms of everything that they were growing to keep them supported. And they moved on then to the next biggest town nearby. But it's definitely an interesting way, and I think it gives us a better look at it all. I definitely would be interested to see any more of graves, and if they were based on hierarchy as well. But when I come to the conclusion now, like I said, my favourite journal in this is Medieval Archaeology Journal, which they were able to provide a lot of reflections and on themselves, as well as the history, to actually get to the most most accurate way of telling the story of these amazing settlements. They said that you know, that there needs to be more use of the technology that we have in front of us, and not be so worried about it. But they want to show how these settlements have their own identity, and so do the people inside them as well. So like I said, we're looking at an individual in terms of how they fitted in with the landscape, how they fitted in with the town, just how they fitted in general, rather than just looking at the settlements as one big group. And I think it definitely shows that there was a change post-war in the way that we looked at settlements, and especially in the 1950s, a lot of academics were driving around getting a sense of these medieval deserted ruins, and arguing that they show the high times of the period, but they had all sort of vanished at their own different times and different paces. But I think it's important to understand each individual settlement in a very deep way, in deep analysis, rather than just sort of looking at it in general with assumptions. because we don't get the full story. And I think Wharram Percy was definitely evidence of that, in terms of people using isotope levels to tell us more about the diet. And that definitely won't be the same for every area, because there's different ways of, you know, one area could be better growing something, whereas the other one couldn't. But I think archaeology needs to be more dominant in this debate, and have, because they're the ones with the conclusive evidence, or more or less, and they should be listened to the most. And medieval settlements, I think, are in the early stages, but they're definitely getting there, and it's definitely interesting to read what comes out of it as well. So I'll escape that and I'll stop share. So I'll ask Peter, anything that you'd like to say?
Only looking at the rabbits, warreners in those days were employed to farm rabbits, particularly out on islands like Flatholm and Steepholm and the other islands of the Severn Estuary. But the warreners were employed to farm rabbits for food for the populace.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whenever I'm going around an archaeology, I always look for the rabbit burrow to see what the rabbits have brought up.
Yeah.
So quite often you'll see bits of pottery and stuff which the rabbits have dug out from
as well.
From the warren. Yep.
Yeah. No, thank you, Peter. Bill, anything that you'd like to ask or add?
Just to know on Peter's comment, weren't they called pillow mounds, Pete?
They were called warrens, and there were warreners that built a warren. They would build a warren.
Right.
They would build the ground around it to encourage rabbits to actually burrow and produce.
I assume they were called pillow mounds as well in Wales, or maybe different.
They may well have been. I didn't know of that. All I know was,
and I'll get in on that. I think I'll make that my homework.
Pillow mounds, yeah. But
it may well be, yeah.
In the bigger picture, archaeology and history work together, and you can argue that archaeology is all about facts, and history then is about the interpretation of those facts, which leads to different opinions and different versions of history and what happened, really. You look at the Time Team series, and there's always like archaeologists there and historians, and they all seem to get on amicably, you know, and come to a similar conclusion. But I'm not convinced that's always the case, really. And of course, if you can't find skeletons near a medieval settlement, that sort of slows down the process of understanding what's happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
As regards the analysis through the teeth and bones, etc., etc. And I think you answered my question about that Hound tour. There was no evidence of skeletons or a cemetery.
No, there wasn't.
Wasn't.
No, and I haven't seen any reference to think that there was. So yeah, it would be very interesting, because from all three settlements really nearby, there was no evidence of burials, etc. So it would be quite interesting to see where that would have happened, or what they would have done for when people passed away.
But to try to get into the mindset of somebody who lived, let's say, in Hound Tor, not easy, but as one sure thing, you know, they didn't have much leisure time, because they were just occupied so much in actually surviving, really. And if any spare time that would have been at the end of the day when they've been exhausted anyway, and possibly on the Sabbath, you know, and maybe they had more time on the Sabbath, you know, that sort of thing. It's difficult, yeah. Can I make a comment on the notes presentation?
Yeah.
We can't see all the writing, because on the right-hand side of the screen, vertically, we've got all our images, and they block out quite a few words. So
what you do there is hang on, I'll go on share screen. Obviously you see the little thing on the side. If you can hover up, there should be like little small boxes, and then like a line. I normally click the line, so you don't really have to see.
There's 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
And a box at the right hand side, is it that?
Yeah, I go for the smallest one, so the least amount of boxes.
Okay, so the smallest one is hide thumbnail video.
Yeah, click on that one.
Right, and it's gone.
Yeah, and it's gone, and you could still see and hear.
Right, okay. And to get it back then, to get the images back,
you just hover on that little box again and click on whatever, because you can have one where is you see the person who's speaking, but I tend to just sort of get rid of faces better so I can see the whole thing. That's
Right,
something that I've learned in the year of lockdown.
Thank you. You answered my question. Thanks.
It's all right. That's me playing around with the laptop. Carl was like, "You are good with tech. Why are you lying?" And I said, "No, Carl, you don't understand the upset that I've gone through to find that out. The amount of buttons I've pressed."
And the thing I do is I hover right between the two, between the picture and between all your faces, and then I just drag the faces over.
Yeah, you can move the faces about as well.
And just drag it over until you all get tall and skinny.
Yeah, you can mess around with it. Pat, anything that you'd like to ask or add? And thank you, Bill.
Things. When we first started, I was still struggling with my computer, my phone, whatever. So
this is recorded, so Carl will put it up, and I'll make sure he gets it to you as well.
I just wanted to know who Wharram Percy was. Who was that? A person?
Yeah, that's a settlement near York, and it's amazing.
Name. It sounds like a person's name.
Yeah, it does sound like a person's name. I haven't really gone into intricate detail, but it would be interesting to see if that was someone who owned it. But I think I will actually make that. I'll come back next week. I've written it down on my little post-it note. Two little things for my homework next week, but I'll find out and I'll be able to tell you. I'll make two like little slides of my question and what I found out.
That thing, it was good to hear about the kilns and the corn dryers. I know what a kiln looks like, but a corn dryer is that wheat they're talking about?
Yeah, wheat.
And how do they dry it? What's
from what I could tell, Carl had said that it basically was these long houses, and towards the end of one of them there was like a hole in it, and we were very confused, and Carl had said maybe this was for the corn drying, and then when I looked into the research of it, so it's almost like at the bottom of the wall is like a little hole coming out, and that's where they had the corn drying. It would have been like a separate room, but when you look at the plans of it, like I said, it's this thing called legendarydartmoor.com, and just look at their they've got a nice little blog on the plans of Hound Tor, but you just type in Hound Tor settlement and it comes up with a lot of lovely little pieces of information there as well.
I'm in here a half hour after your class because I'm looking things up.
Oh, Pat, I love the dedication to it. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, as well. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you very much.
See you next week.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll speak with you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, bye, Pat. Bye, Bill.
Bye, Pete.
Bye.